I won't talk much more simply because there's going to be a lot of empirical data coming in these following interventions. First we will have Christine and Dan talk about the book in 15 minutes to go into the overall insights. Then there will be 2 case studies by Torben and me, and Knud Wilby will discuss the first book, Prosperity in Rural Africa. We have a short coffee break, and then the second book will come on. Again, Christine, and this time with Stefano Ponte, will give an overall presentation of the book with two chapters from the book, and then discussion will be Mikkel Funder. I will present the different speakers as we come along, and then we will have a short half an hour, 25 minutes for discussion, but then there will be time afterwards with snacks and champagne and other things out here for people who have time to stay. So without any further ado, I will hand over to Dan and Christine. And I will, when there's 5 minutes left, I will raise my hand. And 1 minute left, I will raise my hand again. Okay.
Thank you very much, Espen. And what I'm hoping will happen now is that on the screen we should see the Zoom meeting being owned by the colleagues in Tanzania, by Christine, and be able to see their presentation. And given that hasn't happened instantly, let me also add, first of all, in addition to your kind words, Espen, this is a real privilege to be here, folks, and thank you very much indeed for coming. We're very interested in your comments and thoughts and insight into the substance of what we're doing. And I also want to highlight the fact that there's 2 interesting experiments in collaboration that you're going to see. You're going to see, on the one hand, in the book that I present with Christine, the key word here is serendipity, of how we came together to understand these new insights that we're forming. And the key words, I think, for the project that Stefano and Christine led, I would call them meticulous, adventurous planning. And you'll see more of that when you see the nature of the collaborations that were involved. Christine, nimemaliza. Ni zamu yako.
Asante, Dan. Thank you so much, Dan. I'm just handling my technical team to share the screen now, but in the meantime, I am very grateful for this opportunity. At last, this book launch is happening. It's very exciting. It was supposed to be 2 weeks ago, and then I was supposed to be at Copenhagen, but it didn't happen. This was beyond my control, but I'm glad this is now happening. I am based at the Department of Salaam, and I had this privilege of working with Dan Brockington on this book, the research itself, but also the work that edited the book to its current state. As you can see, I'll give it up to my team to show that I want to go to the next slide. Me, technically, we have to organize things. This and very empowering. I wouldn't say it's easy because it wasn't, but I learned a lot, and therefore I really think I would like to have another opportunity to work with Dan and the team that put together this wonderful book. We had some interesting findings, generating narrative areas. And for me, I was very particularly interested by the fact that initially I thought the project was asking very obvious questions, actually, because it's about rural Tanzania, where I happened to be born and grew up. And the question sounded very obvious. But when I started working and discussing and also hearing narratives from other rural areas of Tanzania, I changed my mind that I was very familiar with the narratives. And the popular narrative that we have, no, just before that slide, the popular narrative, as most of you know, we have this one that the rural areas of Tanzania have high, and the fact that Tanzania 151 amongst 188, meaning that it's one of the poorest countries, and documented in policies and also research work. And there is also unsatisfactory levels of poverty reduction. And the blame goes particularly to agricultural sector, which has failed to contribute as it is required. So if we blame the agricultural sector, we blame the rural folks, but also we put blame on the fact that the sector is still using very rudimentary methods of agriculture, but it is also still depending heavily on rain-fed, and now with climate change and land scarcity, the contribution is really going down. So our National Vision 2025 puts this clearly, that low productivity of agricultural economy is to be changed. The agricultural sector has to be transformed. And when it has to be transformed, it means it has to be modernized. And small-scale farmers have to actually be made to produce more. So what seems to be very logical for policymakers is that the transformation will involve getting more land, agricultural land, put under large-scale agricultural farms, so that it will allow large investments which can contribute to the growth of the economy. In the Rio 20 Plus, the Minister of Environment declared that the country was ready to give land, which is known to be empty. The empty thesis is still very much one of the narratives. And this land would be put aside in a form of agricultural corridor. So we have Southern Agricultural Growth Corridor of Tanzania, SAGOT, is a new laboratory for green growth. The green growth debate is clear to most of you, but the thing is, the land that needs to be put aside is still the rural land, which has to be amalgamated to be big enough for large investments. So SAGOT...
Can you hear me? Sorry, I had to interrupt. Is it okay? It's just we can't see your slides. Is it okay?
You can't
okay,
see.
But it just carry on, but we can't see your slides. Just be aware of that.
Oh.
But just carry on with your presentation.
That would be unfortunate because we have shared the slides. Okay, right. My team has heard. But I'm talking about SAGOT, which has taken almost a third of the country, 1/3 of the country, which is also known to be the national granary, and is also land for millions of small-scale farmers. So putting aside land for large investment requires some farmers will be alienated or in a way being denied access to the agricultural land. And in that way, we will have farmers also becoming contract farmers, small-scale farmers becoming contract farmers and outgrowers. This is where the policy is taking these investments. And this is not so new. Many African economies have enjoyed sustained and rapid growth, as they say in statistics. However, it is not clear how inclusive that growth has been. we have GDPs going up, but we have very low level of reduction of poverty, and I'm expecting also to be projecting some statistics here, if they are seen anyhow. But GDP for Tanzania changed, and by 1991, 92, 2000, 2001, we had an increase of 59%, and also 19% up to 2007. But equivalent of that in terms of basic needs poverty, only 2.9% of decrease of poverty and 2.4% respectively in those years. And then food poverty decreased only by 2.9 and 2.2 respectively, despite the fact that there was a change, a significant change of GDP by 59% and 19% respectively. So you can see that GDP is rising significantly, but poverty, different kinds of poverty have decreased only very insignificantly. So we ask if these are actually the right questions to ask why poverty and GDP decline of poverty and increase of GDP are not proportionate. From here, I want to return the mic to Dan Brockington to talk about the next slide. I will come back.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Christine. And if you could move the presentation on 2 slides. So we have a picture of rural Tanzania being poor, and of rural Tanzania is poor because the farmers aren't producing very much. How do we know rural Tanzania is poor? Well, because of the poverty lines and the calculations which go into poverty lines, where we ask people how much they have been spending in the last week in order to draw up baskets of consumption. And from that, we can tell whether people are living off $1 a day or $2 a day. Can we move on to one more slide, please? Now, when you are measuring baskets of consumption, you have to ask people what they spent on their own consumption. You can't ask them what they spent on their business. If I'm a shop owner and I spent $1,000 on cans of Coke in order to sell for my shop, that is my expenditure, but it's expenditure for my business. You do not count productive assets. Did you all know that when you're calculating poverty lines? Because think about the implications if you're a small farmer. And if you're a small farmer and you buy an ox, you've bought a productive asset. That is not counted in poverty line data. If you buy a plough, you've bought a productive asset. You do not count that in poverty line data. You could be a small farmer and buy 10 acres of land, 3 oxen, 4 ploughs, and all the machinery you need to spray and harvest your crops, and none of it is calculated in poverty line data. In fact, you could be a small farmer, and I spoke to some of these farmers, and you're saving money. You're spending less on food and more on your farm, and you could look poorer at the same time as you're getting richer. Investment in productive assets is not counted when you're looking at poverty line data in Tanzania. Now, there are very good reasons for that, but it does mean that there are certain forms of poverty which cannot be captured in poverty line data, and certain forms of wealth and increasing prosperity which also cannot be captured in those data. And the purpose of this project was to go back to families in villages to see how they had changed over time in order to see what is missed by not looking at assets, and does the story of continuous, rather dismal rural poverty continue in Tanzania when we begin to look at assets. And Tina, can I hand back the mic to you, because I think it would be best if we move quickly to the example of Meru, and if you could talk to that. And then if we've got time, I will show you some of the findings from other very quick sites. Because we went to a large number of villages where people had already done the research in Tanzania, looking to go back to these same families to see what had changed. And if we can go on to one more slide, Christine, and I'll hand back over to you.
Thank you very much, Dan. So I worked on a site in Meru, the site which happened, the place where I was born, this site. But I was not the original researcher in 1996. I was still doing my secondary school. And actually, exactly 1996, that's when I came to the university. 1997, that's when I came to the university. So Rolf Larsson was a PhD student from university who had started his PhD work in 1994, and it ran up to 1998. I was very fortunate, given the opportunity to go back, but using the work that Rolf Larsson did in Meru, the question was still for Rolf how Meru livelihoods adopted to the market and land scarcity, as well as institutional changes so that he could contribute to the de-agrarianization debate. So he did very thorough study with the wealth ranking and surveys in very many villages, 9 villages. So he interviewed about 753 households in terms of questionnaire interviews, but with a lot of key informant interviews. A lot of data was deposited in a very secure database at Lund with his supervisors. But unfortunately, when we were designing this project, Rolf Larsson had passed away, so he could not come as other researchers to redo the study. So I happened to be the person who went back to Meru, and when I say going back to Meru, I mean that I went back home to do research, and that was technically difficult because that's where, when I started, I said all the questions almost seemed like obvious issues. But next, please. What I found from Rolf's data is that he did wealth ranking, and he had 5 ranking groups. As you can see, the first is poorest and the last is wealthiest. The wealthiest is only 9.7% of the population that he studied, and 16.1% for the poorest. But if you see the small table down here, you will see that the wealthy people, this 9.7%, had ownership of land up to 62%, and the poorest had only 4.4% of the land. So there was much, much land inequality in Meru during Rolf's study. And the question is whether this historical inequality of land ownership would determine future generation. This is the question that I went with. And one other set of data that was of interest is that Rolf looked at what people did with money when they sold their pieces of land. For those who knows, land in Meru is very scarce because of high density, population density. So a piece of land is very valuable. Can you go back, please? I did not finish the slide. Back, yes. So this is how people spent land, money from land. And my particular attention is on the red color, where you see that the first group, which is the poorest, had spent their money on educating children, followed by the highest is middle, but also the poorest had a significant portion of their investments into education. Compare the rest of the groups did, you'll find that this education had a significant share of how land finances were used. Of course, people paid for other issues. They did transform their houses, but they invested in business. More of them also bought new land elsewhere, mostly in lowlands. But you can see that education had the big share of investment from land.
Dina, samahani dakika moja sasa.
So I'm told there's 1 minute left. What I would like you to see is the impact of investment on education for Meru children. The lower lines indicate boys and girls of Meru. Unfortunately, the blue line is for girls. This is Dan who did the blue line for girls. But as you can see, and as in other rural areas, girls were not doing very well in education in 1996 and above. Come 2007, as you can see, all of them had gone well in education, but girls were actually doing far better. And this is not normal, it's unique actually for girls to be more educated than boys. Last slide says that when you compare, no, there's one before that. When you compare Meru, okay, maybe I lost this slide. That one. When you compare education for Meru children and go specifically to the university level where you see 12% for Meru children, that compares only with 1% for the national levels of education. When 12% of Meru children have come to the university, only 1% have come from elsewhere. Then I'm returning this to you. The next slide, please. Yes.
Thank you. If I could ask you to present the very last slide, because I'm going to bring this to conclusion. What we have in Meru then is a story of peasants investing in education as an asset which will sustain their families in the years to come. And what we had repeatedly in the chapters of this book is the same story of small farmers investing considerably in assets in ways which you couldn't well capture through the poverty line index. And I need to go to the very last slide at the end of the presentation to make the point I'm making. This book is freely available to everyone. It is on open access. You can download it through multiple sites. And in fact, because of Christine's networks, when it was first released, it was downloaded 1,500 times in 3-day period, almost entirely through through Tanzania and East African interest. And what we found, and this is what Stefano Ponti and I did on the analysis of the data across the study sites, is that we tend to find in Tanzania wealth distributions which are skewed to the poorest, where you have more families who are poor, and we still get that in some of the villages we went to. But we also came across distributions which showed that in fact you've got more people in the middle groups now of some of these study sites. There you can see the Meru sites at the top there that Christine was talking about. And because of investment in assets, this traditional skewed distribution, in some cases, not all, but in some cases, you're getting an increase in the middle group of the small farmers who are there. That's all we have for the introduction. Thank you very much, Tina, for coping with the technology. Espen, I think we hand over to our colleagues to present more detailed case studies that appear in the book. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stan and Christine. So Torben Thompson will be from lecture in geography. Birk Thompson from lecture from geography. Copenhagen University will present a case study following up on the SASA program, which we did back in the 90s in Ismani.
Yes, and I would like to try to illustrate a few of the points that you were pointing at here at the end. But I'll try to take you through approximately like 15 slides, so I better get started. And it was done by the revisit was done with Espen, but the first study that was undertaken in partly Ismani and Mazombe, or Ismani ward and Ilula ward, was done with the SASA project from 94, I think, to 2001, together with Pia Frederiksen from RUC at that time, and for the Human Rights Center. I forgot the name, sorry. Hans Otto Sano, thank you, Hans Otto, and he's here. I'm so sorry. It's a long time ago, but anyway, yes, Hans Olsen. So I just wanted to mention that because it's the data that we based our revisit. As was explained, we wanted to go back to the households that we interviewed in these two. There was 34 in each village, and we had 22 in Ilambilole and 26 in Ikubana and Ilambilole up here. And then we have Ilula located here, which is like the local center or service center. I'll come back to that. So I'll try to take you through some of the conclusions we had at that point and then compare it to the observations at present. So in those days, in 98, we concluded that low to no use of external seasonal inputs. So it was very low productive farming without hybrid seeds, fertilizer and pesticides. Ox plows was based, or hoe cultivation was the basic labor, and maize-based systems and sunflower. So relatively pure in crop diversity. What we observed presently here, increased use of inputs, fertilizer, pesticides, and so on, and intensive use of new high-yielding tomato seeds, varieties, and other inputs. So, and then another interesting point was a decreased cultivated area. So, some kind of an intensification. Ox plowing and tractor was now the main technologies used, and decreased cattle mortality due to better health with the dipping system and so on, particularly in Ilambilole, where we also had Maasai groups staying, so there was a large number of livestock. And then irrigation of tomato in nurseries. And I'll give you an example of Charles here, who was one of the households we returned to. And this was actually the son of one of the household heads we interviewed in '96. His father passed away, and he was, as a 16-year-old, taking over the responsibility of the household. And he decided at that point to go against the traditional way of dividing land or inheriting land. So he was actually insisting on that his sisters was going to take part in this land ownership. And it was a very poor household at that time. So he could not see himself making a living with such very little land. So he decided to go to Dar es Salaam, and one of the sisters actually had gone before him. So he used that as a stepping stone to get access to skills or income. And remittances became then quite important for the household, for his sisters back in the village. Returning, then, he used some of his investment in both microfinancing, getting access to that. He was linking to the Lula market through the tomatoes. And as you see the picture here, he had, with his wife, a small nursery where he had two different, kind of with 1 week in between, so he could actually replant in the case of delay in rainfall. And this actually managed him to have quite an increased income. We'll get back to I'll show you his house. But 4 bags of food security storage he could actually buy from this success. So I talked about diversification. In terms of livelihoods, very limited diversification in those days. Mostly household was when we were wanting to accumulate your resources, it was through access to land. So at those days, the most important part was to get more land. Now, and for those we called peasants, or it was about staying as farmers. So the focus of investments was trying to remain as farmers, where labor coping strategies were more selling the labor through traditional ways or through more casual labor paid by by money. Today, we see a diversification of livelihoods much more widely, crop trading, high threshold enterprises such as shops and hiring of transport and tractor plowing services and so on. So a much more broader, not just within the agricultural sector, but also beyond. And you also see this for all categories. Okay, 5 minutes? What? 1 minute? Okay, I'll skip this, but to illustrate, this was one of the female-headed households back in the early days. She was a poor household, but very innovative in making arrangements with the Maasai, getting access to manure for grazing on her crop residues. And she had actually moved into investing in a number of different this entrepreneurship she now used into other sectors beyond her agriculture. The labor market changed from a local market to a more commercialized labor market. Previously, it was more local labor. Now it's labor migrants coming and staying for a whole season and working. So there's a huge change in the labor market in that sense. On the environmental change, we could say, well, population growth had happened. It has changed from immigration to immigration, which is interesting for Ilambelole. People from Iringa was actually moving to Ilambelole to access cheap land, access land to grow food, crops, and so on. Agricultural intensification was also taking place, but basically higher stress on water, soil fertility, and grazing area, and particularly firewood, was seen. So it was not all kind of a blooming story, but also increased pressure on resources. This is just to show, I will not go into depth, but you can see the first column, very short, in 2017, a very long list. So we talked with people about how do you describe well-being and what criteria can be used to actually categorize people. And it's just to illustrate from a very short list in 96. This was much more longer and broader in 2017, based on people's way of describing different wealth categories. And this was illustrated, I mean, this change. Here you can see the typical house in 96 with thatch roof, no windows, perhaps not at all, poor condition, not clay walls and so on. And then this is actually Charles in his new home with a thatch, tin roof. And a solar panel, and look at the window, high quality window, and so on. So basically, he has improved his living standard. And if you look at the inside, he has electricity in the house. So a clear improvement in his life. These were the assets that we looked at, and on the left-hand side, the dark columns is back in 96, and you see the ownership of these other assets. And obviously, they are not distributed equally, but there will tend to be a kind of a movement upwards. We had very few observations, so making statistics of this would not make sense, but I've tried to show the observation as they were distributed into these wealth categories. And it was a mixed picture. However, we can see that the group of poor people have decreased in both cases, and there's been an increase in the middle group. So pointing a little bit on some of the issues that Dan also mentioned. And in our kind of summary of trying to understand this, we try to illustrate it with this book, with this figure. where we have an increase in the wealth in general, but more in a sense on the upper class here or in the upper part than in the lower part, but a general lift for the whole communities, these communities. And if you look at the mobility, as you can see, we have actually some that used to be wealthy back in the 96, who have now moved to the middle group. And from the middle group, people have actually moved in both directions, both becoming more poor today, but also moved to the well-off group. And for both of the two, even though there's no kind of clear pattern, we have a decrease in those who were poor back in 96 compared to 2017. And yeah, I know I'm at the limit now, so this is the second last slide, I think, or maybe the last. So about accessibility and infrastructure and social services, here we can see that this is, as you mentioned on the education, in your study, similar points, improved education. In those days, there were no one having secondary education in the village. However, that has changed dramatically. Infrastructure, government financed infrastructure, marketplace, secondary schools. So the government policies has also added to this in the sense of improvement. And this is the final point, is that having a small urban center, emerging urban center like Ilula, that has actually developed and bloomed within these 20 years, has been an important factor for creating jobs, for creating an economy, not only as these pictures here are all related to the tomato production, but also into other sectors. So this is my final slide. So the overall conclusions, when we look at this growth in the GDP, can we actually see that that has actually had a positive impact, and there's indication that that's the case, and partly due to entrepreneurship, investments, better accessibility, the center, but also with these government or state donor investments has made a difference. However, and I think that's what we saw as well, we see also a kind of a downwards flow of certain households, and that's basically to those not being able to actually make a benefit out of these new tendencies in terms of access to assets. Sorry for the going over time. That's it.
Thank you very much, Torben. Yes, I have 2 minutes for mine, but so we're a bit over time. Okay. The aim of this study back in 83 to 85 was to understand villagization, which took place a decade earlier in the dry season of 1974, where everyone was moved, living scatteredly, moved into up to the road or in nuclear settlements, and the effect of agriculture and well-being. The location is in what's today in Jombe region, in Maketa and in Jombe, and the methodology back then was I had 66 households, and most of it was qualitative data, and a number of other surveys. It was labor survey and measured all farmers' fields and so on. I had a visit in 2011 before this project where I made group interviews, and then from 2017 I managed to interview 34 of the domestic units and secondary units. And because of the low number, I followed up with more qualitative interviews and well-being ranking. based on Hellemund Raunborg's well-being ranking methodologies from '99. So a few words on the findings. Back there, I found different village types of village typologies, and more importantly, a huge intra-village, unequal inter-village settlement patterns. That means some farmers were moved up to 5 hours away from their fields and suffered subsequently, and others were hardly affected by villagization. So this Operation Sogesa had a huge impact on social differentiation in the villages. Unsustainable intensification of crop production, reduced fallow rotation, more dense intercropping, changing cropping patterns led to a fall in soil fertility and yields, particularly around the settlement areas, because very limited access to fertilizer. And generally, based on family labor and reciprocal labor arrangement, the traditional Migo system, there was no renting of labor. Everything was exchanged among, even with the wealthy farmers. Very much a subsistence system with a few bags of surplus production for buying, for getting money for school fees and salt and sugar and the like. And 3 overlapping food bridges, first described by Branner Jespersen in '71. And very much interfered with Ujamar, everyone forced to grow on the Ujamar field for the benefit of village government, and the Bekker side-by-side fields where they were demanded what to do, but they could get the benefits themselves, as described by Phil Rakes back in '86. So in the 80s, I'll quickly go through the 80s, 90s, and 2000. Since 2000, you had a lot of macroeconomic imbalances and economic crisis, as Jannik Boesen describes in his '86 book, and really erratic supply of all commodities. There was crisis during this time, and it was very much a state-sponsored agriculture modernization, where the state subsidized fertilizer, hybrid seeds, and pan-territorial prices, and you had to sell to the state monopolies. But however, you had as Rasmussen in '86 described the Green Revolution, and we went from 2,000 to 250,000 tons of marketed maize in the Southern Highlands. It became the food basket for the whole country, and the yields went up from 0.5 tons to 3 tons per hectare, and very much based on access to the subsidized fertilizer and the pan-territorial prices. The 3 villages which I surveyed were, for various reasons, not very much part of this Green Revolution, because there was only around 1/3 of the farmers who had access to these loans and inputs, and all of these 3 villages were spatial and political marginalized and was mostly kept out of it. In the 90s, then you see the structural adjustment, liberalized markets, and the subsidies were ended, and the pan-territorial prices were ended, and it had a socially biased and spatially skewed effect. The Green Revolution collapsed in the Southern Highlands, and they went back to food insecurity. It was a big step back, and the maize production moved further to Dar es Salaam, up to Morogoro and elsewhere. And you had an enormous increase of labor migration from the Southern Highlands to urban centers during this period. So those who were best off were the ones who fell lowest. Since 2000 and up to today, and especially after 2005, we've had an agrarian transformation in the Southern Highlands again. They've come back with a potato green revolution here in Mamogolo, one of the tree villages, and a commercial pine tree production, the timber rush, both in Maliwa and Mamogolo in the case study here. And similar to what Torben describes, in Nkamanga has now is based on tomato production for Makobako nearby. So it's very much based on the free access to agricultural inputs and machinery, especially after the import of machinery from China in 2005, which opened up for a lot of machinery coming in, which helped enormously, and better road and market access. This is a private sector-driven development with very little support from neither government or donors. Much of this is happening under the radar. Well, not so much under the radar anymore, but very much on a private sector development. In terms of rural transformation, these are the 3 villages. Back in the 70s, there was only a primary school out in these villages. Then in the 80s, you got community shops and community milling machines and a dispensary. Then you had the NIDA-funded rural water supplies coming in many villages. And all 3 villages had a secondary school next to their village. You got iron sheets on the roofs, and you got private shops in the 90s, and particularly after 2000, you get what Torben also talked about: solar electricity in the houses, mobile phones, particularly access to irrigation, these plastic pipes, which made a huge difference for enabling farmers to irrigate, and very motorbike sawmills, and here in the tents you got a daily bus service and improved markets. So a lot of rural transformation going on. To talk about the well-being, I've taken the example of Maliwa village. Back when I first came out there, 85% was poor, according to farmers' own perception of poverty. I remember many women only had one kanga. I mean, many poor people only had one piece of clothes. Most people were food insecure. So there was, there wasn't really a middle class. And when we did it again here in 2017, 50% was in a one away, so able to get by, and 25% well off, 25% poor. This is a typical shop out in the villages now. A few words on this well-being criteria, because that's another way of understanding what have changed. The A is the asset-based criteria. We talked about the house. Back then, all houses were unburned bricks and thatched roof. Now we're talking about, as a well-being ranking for the well-off, what's inside the house, not how the house looks like. We're talking about it's plastered, it has solar, glass windows, satellite TV, water tap inside. For the clothing, we're now talking about following fashion and getting second-hand clothes from Europe and having plenty of clothes. Talk about the relational well-being rankings. Back then it was the MIGO, the reciprocal labor arrangements. Now the poor, growing number of poor are working year-round for the well-off. You are beginning to have a formalized rural labor market. And for the well-off category, they hire maybe 2-3 people year-round for all kinds of tasks. Back then, they did not hire anyone. So there's a major change. And for the social well-being ranking, that you have similar. I want to look just to mention the health. The education. access to education. Everyone was public primary schools back then. Now the well-off have private secondary schools and ability to move on to university. But even the poorer people can have a chance to go to university if they are outstanding and if the community sponsor their trip and fees at university, which actually happens. I will stop there and move the floor to Knud for commenting on the book. Thanks.
Thank you, Esben. I'll then use the coffee break. But it's not my fault. I have followed Tanzania since '69, and thank you for giving me this opportunity to see what has happened over the last 20 years in the rural areas. I think it's a convincing message. There has been much more progress than we have known, many of us. And what is important also that compared to stereotypes, the rural population is much more ready or to adapt to new circumstances and to change. I have not been able to read all chapters, but most of them. And it is a number of stories about innovation, intensification, diversification, farmers being able to see what is possible, being able to look and listen and work for new opportunities. And I think that is a very positive, not known message about rural development in Tanzania. There's a marked difference between development in the 90s and the development after year 2000. And it brought me back to 20 years back when I fell over. I met a Vietnamese economist, Doduk Din, in Dar es Salaam, and he gave me a copy of a new research study called Economic Reform in Tanzania and Vietnam, a comparative commentary. And it was this comparison between Vietnam and Tanzania, and interesting in the sense that both countries were socialist countries trying to move towards a market economy. And there were many differences, of course, and Vietnam was doing far better than Tanzania in those days, no doubt about it. But what struck me when I read it was that in Vietnam, you had a well-functioning infrastructure. You had agricultural advice and services benefiting agricultural change, rural change in Vietnam. Whereas in Tanzania, you more or less closed down the whole public, not very well functioning system, liberalized, but without having a new system to replace the old system. So, and especially, of course, for those who lived in the periphery, marginal areas, there were no middlemen coming to buy their products. There were no access to hybrid seeds, no access actually to markets for many of them. There's a lot of mentioning about tomatoes, but you can only sell tomatoes on the market if you can access the market within relatively few hours. If not, you can forget it. So that was interesting to read, and it was a positive experience to read this. Esben mentioned now, and it has also been mentioned at some places in the book, that it has, to a large degree, been a private sector development without support from the government. But I think it has to be mentioned that it's also very obvious that over the time, there's a lot of indirect public support or government support. Better infrastructure, a much better functioning service sector, schools, you mentioned it, also health systems. So it creates hope and opportunities which were not there before. So I think that is one extremely important message from this. It raises a number of questions, of course. One is, and that's also mentioned in the book, how much can these results change the overall picture of the national development of Tanzania? I think it's in chapter 5, it says that village level data have considerable importance in pointing to the path whereby national developments affect the lives of citizens, which of course is true, but that also leads to other questions which are not answered by the book and maybe should not be answered by the book. And one, and you have touched upon it, several of you, the whole question about migration out of rural areas. Again, it's interesting that we see that in some areas, I think it was, I made a note from, what's it, Mbulu? Yeah, Mbulu district, where we have an intensification of production, even when at the same time the average landholding size is going down from 2.5 to 2 acres over this period of time, meaning that in a way it is possible to live more people in rural areas, even with better lives. A clear indication there's a lot in favor of small-scale farming. But still, there is, of course, a kind of a rural exodus also. In my own book from 20 years ago, I have a quotation from Professor Baregu at the University of Dar es Salaam, political science professor. And he then said, in 15 to 20 years, we'll have to fence off the whole area of the capital city to protect it against immigrants. If what is happening now continues, then it will be incredibly difficult to put a brake on the flood of people from the rural areas to Dar es Salaam. It is more than 15 or 20 years ago he said so, so it wasn't true what he said, but of course still it's part of the story that the overall growth in population of Tanzania, and even Mama Samia spoke about it recently. I said it has to be brought to or be not brought to a stop, but be reduced considerable. That growth is especially today a growth in urban areas. And before we can answer the question whether this progress in rural areas is a reflection of overall progress, we also need to know more about the poverty level in for instance, slum areas, in the urban areas. How many have had to leave the rural areas to make this development possible, and how big is the absorption capacity in urban areas? We all know that unemployment is a major problem in Tanzania, and many are facing difficult times, but nevertheless, they may have seen some improvements there also. But I think before we can answer this question, to which degree this influences the national development, we need to know more about the migration patterns. Just a question, and you, Dan, and others have said something about it already, but of course the question, should this be an incentive to an adjustment in poverty statistics for a country like Tanzania? again, I think there are questions unanswered, making it difficult to say how and when. But at the same time, you are arguing that poverty figures may be too high. There may be some kind of systematic errors in the way poverty is being measured. And if that is true, also at a national level, then of course it should lead to changes. And it is true that whenever we look upon poverty statistics for Tanzania, we see that, as we also saw here, that there's a quite impressive growth in GDP, but only a very slight reduction in poverty. Part of it has to do with also population growth, and that was what Mama Samia said just a few weeks ago. Where should all the new classrooms come from, the new health centers and so on, with a growth as big as it is in Tanzania at the moment? Of course, it is using many of the resources which could be reduced, could be used for reducing poverty in a more stable society. But I think it's still interesting to look into whether there is a need to change the way the statistic is made. And then only a very, very brief thing about communication in relation to the work you have been doing here. For good reasons, it has taken some time, 20 years, 25. When Espen started, it's almost 40 or how many? Yeah. I think it's important what you have done. And in spite of 1,500 downloads, I do also feel that it should be communicated maybe in a more kind of easy. I'm an old journalist, so I like easy reading, and this may not be easy reading in that sense. So I think that the results deserve a communication which is also available for politicians. They don't read that much. Civil servants, journalists, the more informed part of the public and so on. So I think it's very important to do an effort to go beyond what is in the book which you are launching here today. But thank you for having given me the opportunity to read and follow. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Knud. There's a small coffee break now. We will all get a chance to comment later. Could we hold it for 10 minutes? We are a few minutes behind, so go and grab a cup of coffee, mingle a little bit, come back at 10 minutes to 3, 11 minutes.
huyu anasema kwamba unaweza ku
Oh. Now I see Christine.
Okay,
Hey. 2 seconds.
2 seconds.
In the PowerPoints as well?
Do you see our PowerPoint?
No, not yet.
Um,
You need to share your screen.
shared now.
Not yet. But I see you perfectly, Christine.
The problem is the PowerPoint.
1, 2.
And I think we're
Okay.
almost there.
If
Then you just need to put it in presentation mode, and then we are ready to go. No, not that one.
yeah, can you start the first slide, please? I think it's the same, but this is not the first.
You have to put it up like in the big. Right now I can see the notes.
If we are ready, I can actually talk about the first slide, which doesn't need my.
And now the slide is gone again, but maybe the technicians can put it up while you are talking, maybe. Should we do it like that?
If you see clearly, because for us we see clearly, he has shared with you already. Please
We can see you, but we can't see your shared screen. Like we can't see the PowerPoint.
It is shared.
Jamen det er fordi jeg har slået den fra. Men jeg skal nok sætte den derop. You just keep shutting it down again. Yeah, perfect. Espen is going to start now. Is that okay?
Yes, please. We are ready.
Perfect, thanks.
Okay, I think the technical glitches are solved. So we leave the word to Christine now in Dar es Salaam.
Thank you very much, Espen, for organizing this again. And as I spoke earlier, I had privilege to work again on this second book with Stefano Ponte, but Dan Brockington was also part of this. Indeed, a very efficient team. With me in the room are also two of the presenters of this book, Dr. Pili Silvano and Dr. Faraja Namkesa. They will come up here, and therefore you will have a chance to also see them. So the contested sustainability book is a product of a Danida-funded project, which started in 2016. We just ended in March this year. And it was a team which was made of a multidisciplinary team of researchers. I think we have skipped one slide which had, okay, maybe it was removed. But it's a team that had many scientists from geography, from political science, environment and development studies. But we had also students, PhD students, 3 female PhD students who graduated last year. We also had 2 postdocs, and we worked on natural resource sectors of Tanzania, forestry sector, coastal resources, and wildlife resources. As you can see from the images, we had these natural resource sectors studied in different districts of the country, which I will speak in another slide. So why did we embark on this project? In the recent years, we observed the mushrooming of different forms of co-management arrangements of natural resources. And as most of you would agree with me, that some of these arrangements had complex setups in terms of their institutional features and also the networks that formed them. So we studied these partnerships based on their levels of complexity. And we decided to ask whether more complex partnerships would have any difference from those that are less complex, or where there are no partnerships at all. So our questions precisely were whether these co-management initiatives make difference, if so, in what ways, and also with what outcomes ecologically and also in terms of livelihood outcomes. And we looked at the institutional features of these networks, these partnerships, but also their embeddedness in terms of, the number of actors involved, number of categories of these actors, how decision-making system is for different natural resource sectors, how participation is done, how decentralization process was implemented, but also what kind of sharing arrangements existed in these different sectors to give access to natural resources to partners. We call them partners because they are all made to participate as partners in natural resource management. So our research questions related to the practical issues of particularly how partnerships are formed, and therefore we asked configuration in terms of how actors come together to make a partnership, but also the context. These different sectors have different contexts, but also how networks have formed in these different natural resource sectors. And we also asked process questions in relation to how partnerships are governed, what gives them legitimacy, but also what their political ecology is in every resource sector. Lastly, we had questions related to impacts. We asked what sustainability outcomes these conservation partnerships had in these different natural resource sectors. So we studied impacts in terms of, in these different questions and also contexts of natural resources. And our research design, as I have said already, had to select and to be careful to also understand complexity in terms of the sites, but also arrangements that make these partnerships, and to select carefully representation of these partnerships in different natural resource management governance in the country. And for us, we selected more complex partnerships in wildlife, called wildlife management areas, but also we saw that given the number and categories of partners in forest management, also community-based forest management became part of the complex partnership arrangement. BMUs in coastal resources, beach management units also had characteristics of a complex partnership arrangement. So these three were cases for each natural resource sector for more complex partnerships. Then we had some simpler partnership sites and categories, which areas, we selected areas that mostly border protected areas, such as game reserves. Specifically, we studied the southern Tanzania. So when we say game reserves, we mainly looked at areas close to Selous Game Reserve, but also areas close to forest reserves in Kilwa, and areas close to the marine park in Mtwara. And we thought that these were simpler because they have fewer actor categories, but also low degree of sharing among different actors. And they had attempts to co-manage, but mainly from top down. These arrangements which the government has direct influence on how partners participate. But the last category is sites with no partnerships. The previous slide had no partnership category. And these are sites where wildlife or forest or coastal resources happen, they are there, but they have not attracted partners to come and facilitate partnerships to form with local communities. So there's this appearance of resources, but with no formalized kind of partnerships in these areas. So we also took this as control sites for our study. As I said earlier, we had southern Tanzania, which is to provide one socioeconomic context for studying these categories of sites, and to also support our design so that we don't have differences in terms of socioeconomic setups. So in southern Tanzania, we studied Rufiji as a site for wildlife, which is just close to Kilwa, which was our forest site, and then Mtwara, which was our coastal site. We selected these carefully to also represent the society in there, but also villages that some of them are bordering protected areas, some of them are in the middle, but some of them have no collaborations at all. And as you can see, the team that I mentioned, multidisciplinary, had opportunities to do joint activities, including joint fieldworks in Tanzania, the Copenhagen Business and other partners, Sheffield then, where Dan was working from, and also Roskilde, had opportunities to join the team here to work together in the field, but also we did joint conference activities and joint workshops and retreats. But here, data collection, we did 2 rounds of fieldworks in between April-March 2017. Also, we repeated that in August-September. But we finished our fieldwork in August-September 2018, and we collected data in forms of secondary documents and primary also information from key informant interviews, but focus group discussion, observations. We had a survey and a lot of remote sensing information from our experts. I will welcome Stefano from here, but we will see how this data was used in different chapters by our different authors, but also in terms of how we analyzed the data. As I said earlier, one of the strengths of this project really, and the reason we have this book today, which is actually physically here and also is online for free, is because we had a team, very tight together team, which had opportunities to be together, activity in the field. This was in Kilwa, in Kilwa, yes. After fieldwork, all the groups came together to discuss the kinds of data we have, the gaps, and how to move forward. But we had opportunities to stay in Copenhagen as a team. We had opportunities to attend conferences as a team. So this team and joint activities in data collection, data analysis, sharing of data in conferences and workshops, joint writing have brought us here together as contributors of this book. So Stefano and I are very, very happy that finally the team put up this book together. Stefano, I return the mic to you.
Thank you, Christine. Thank you. So can I have the slide with the book? The next slide, please, from Dar. So the book is not a monograph because it's a group effort, but it's not an edited book like we know, right? We collect people from different places and try to put it together. It's a sort of in between, right? So it's part of one project, and it has some specialization, but the input in all chapters came from group work, essentially. And then for certain chapters, there was a specialization that is related to the sector or the kind of approach that we took. The next slide, please. So open access. The book is organized in 3 parts. So the first part is an introduction where we tell you what we're doing, a background in terms of understanding the contemporary conservation dynamics in Tanzania from a historical perspective and a comparative perspective. And I think that the best chapter is actually the methodology chapter, which is very unusual in a book. But because we used very different instruments, but then they came together from remote sensing all the way to participant observation, and you have indeed the whole group is in that chapter. I highly recommend it if you're interested in these kind of issues, especially how the modeling and high-end work, the heavily quantitative and modeling work was melded and shaped by the qualitative work that came from really dedicated long-term presence in the field. Then we have 3 chapters that are on sectoral analysis. So you have the 3 case studies. So if you're interested in one of them, you can go in and find out what is going on in wildlife or forestry or coastal resources. Next slide, please. And then we have a third part that is then doing the cross analysis. So we have a chapter on legitimacy that is essentially run through the lenses of political science in terms of trying to understand how these partnerships are seen or not seen from local communities as legitimate in order to shape sustainability processes and outcomes. And then we have a chapter on complexity, because that was our starting point. Are all these complex setups that we're seeing internationally, transnationally, and nationally in relation to sustainability, do they make a difference? Or are they making things more difficult just because they're complex? And we hear from that in a moment in the presentation by Dr. Faraj Lamkesa and Lasse Eriksson. We also will hear specifically one of the sectoral studies from Dr. Pili Silvano and from our colleague Mette Olbig here. Then we looked at the impact. So we have 2 chapters, one on the environmental impacts and one on the livelihood impacts, and then a conclusion. Next slide, please. So that's a picture of the book. You can download it on your phone or wherever you want. If you want a hard copy, of course, you're also welcome to order that. It exists. We got one. After a lot of fight with the taxation authorities in Denmark, they wanted to charge me for importing a book that I wrote together with other people, and some of us still fighting for that. So main lessons in relation to legitimacy. These partnerships have really struggled to gain legitimacy, with the exception of forestry sites, and there is a good reason in relation to that, and I'll tell you in a moment. Why? Because there are the lack of material incentives. You can't just go into an area and say, well, you need to take care of your environment, okay? You can't go in and fish here, okay? So how do I do it, and what else should I be doing? And therefore, there's like major impacts on livelihoods. So you need better ways to combine livelihoods and conservation than we have seen, except for forestry. So the general kind of approach to this is like, oh, we're going to throw these projects here, alternative livelihood activities. Here's the project. You know what happens with projects, right? They start, some of them work, some of them go out, the money is not there, people move on. They have the wrong, livelihood activity for a certain socio-cultural context, all sorts of stuff. They all really didn't, none of them worked, okay? And in cases where they worked, the benefits really went to a small elite. Next slide, please, from Dar. Wow, you guys are so efficient. Complexity. Lasse and Pili and Faraja and Amkeza will talk about that. So I'm just going to tell you that there are two elements of complexity. One is networks and one is institutional complexity. And there is a correlation between the two. However, more complex networks predate the complexity of institutions. So there is a historical trajectory there that Lasse will talk about. And therefore, from a policy perspective, we don't talk too much about that today, that there is something about network building that needs to precede the initiation of these partnerships. I'm simplifying everything here. It's a lot more complex than this. But next, please. Next slide. So in terms of environmental impact, we actually have a positive link between institutional complexity and environmental outcomes, at least in terms of forest cover. Okay? And we can measure that with remote sensing data. For other aspects that are not forest cover, it's much less clear. But then again, institutional complexity is not something that happens out of nowhere. Is often deliberately constructed, and it needs to be maintained, and again involves previous work in building complex networks. So there is a relatively positive story in relation to forestry, in correlation to the complexity of these partnerships that are in action. Not in fisheries, although coastal resources also include mangroves, so there's a good story on mangrove here and on coral, but not so much on fisheries. And on wildlife, it's not working like that. Next slide, please. And here's where we are drawing some parallels and making connections with the first book you saw today. So there are two elements I want to highlight here in the few minutes that I have. Instead of decentralization, what's happening is that obligations for sustainability management are being moved to the local level without the resources that should be coming with it in order to manage these resources. So, you know the whole story about middle management, right? They give you something to do without the resources, and then you're like, okay, this is the same thing. A lot more demands on local networks, local government, and these institutional and organizational setups without the resources that should go with it. The other observation we have across the board is these partnerships are very good at providing training on conservation issues. Okay? The knowledge that local communities have on various layers of conservation has increased a lot according to their own reporting systems through both the survey and in participant observation and also in focus groups. However, as we said before, not so good in setting up alternative livelihood activities that could make up for some of the lack of access to resources that are being put in place in order to, in the name of conservation. Therefore, they have limited effects on socioeconomic and livelihood outcomes, especially at the household level. So we haven't seen that link very strongly. Next. Next slide, please, from Dar. Yeah, we're done. It just is, let me see.
Stefano, this is the last slide we have on this.
That explains it. Okay, then we're done. Not even that 1 minute. All right. Thank you.
So the next speaker will come and continue from where you just stopped.
Thank you very much. So I'll call on Mette, Olvi, and Pili Silvano from Dar es Salaam. 10 minutes, please.
Yes. Yes, so if you could please put up the slides. So yes, so Pili and I will be presenting the chapter on the forestry sector. And Tanzania has a lot of forested land. And in order to conserve some of this forest, has established forest reserves. And these forest reserves differ in that some are, you're allowed to, businesses, communities, and the state are allowed to take out forest resources. So yes, so in order to then manage, yes, you can go to the next slide, please. So in order to balance the interests that then arise when you're allowed to do this, the environmental interest and the economic interest, there's of course the question of who then manages these forest reserves. And in Tanzania, they have two types of forest management that can involve the community. They have what is called joint forest management, which can be implemented on the government-controlled national forest reserves. And then you have the other type, which is community-based forest management, which can be implemented in the community-controlled village land forest reserves. So as the topic of the overall book looked at, we're looking at in this chapter is community-based forest management more just and sustainable than traditional top-down forms of resource management. And we would have liked to look at JFM, but at the time of our research, there were no functioning JFM. All right, you can go to the next slide, please. Can you go to the next slide, please? No, yeah, one back. Yes. So as is indicated by its title, community-based forest management, in theory, this emphasizes the role of the community. But in practice, there are a lot of other partners involved, in part for the reasons that Stefano was mentioning. So you have NGOs involved, businesses involved, certification agencies involved, also government authorities and timber traders in the case of our study sites. So these multi-stakeholder partnerships, they do lead to networks that Les also will talk more about, and to access to resources, but of course they also lead to interest clashes. And this creates some dilemmas. Can you go to the next slide? Can you go to the next slide, please? That we will talk more about in this presentation. So in the, just very briefly, we looked at 4 communities that had CBFM and 4 that did not have CBFM to compare. And you can see the location of the different study sites, and you can click next, please. Yeah, and you can see the different types of forests, and you can see this very forested area. So even though an area is not classified as a forest reserve, there can be quite a lot of trees in this area. All right, can you click next, please? And also, I'm not going to go into details here, but it was this part of the research also relied on many different types of data and data collection. Next slide, please. So what we discovered in our study site was that there was a key actor that really enabled these partnerships to succeed, and that was MCDI. So I'll talk more about MCDI. Community-based forest management was originally introduced by Danita in the 2000s, but was quickly taken over by this NGO called Mpingo Conservation and Development Initiative, or MCDI. And indeed, MCDI is involved in all CBFM projects in this district. Originally, MCDI was focused on Mpingo, the East African blackwood, which is a local hardwood tree of commercial value. So this was the original focus, but it became more generally focused on CBFM through these actions. Next slide, please. And so MCDI has many different roles in terms of these partnerships. And one, it's the initiator of these CBFMs. And this already here starts creating some dilemmas. For example, in order to cover the costs that are entailed in running these CBFMs, for example, there are costs of forest management, patrolling, fire prevention. MCDI has chosen to focus on areas that have the impingo, which is the commercial hardwood tree, because then they can make some funds. But this also means that you prioritize a certain tree species over others and a certain type of forest over others. Next slide, please. MCDI is also the convener of collaboration between different actors. So that means that they have a big role in terms of which actors are involved. And they have even created their own actors, having a difficult time finding a timber company that they felt was fair. They created Sound and Fair, a timber buying company. And they're also the facilitator of for example, these certifications and RED Plus, and also access to the market, by having the technical, logistical, and financial resources to enable these communities to get access to this. But then that creates opportunities, but it also creates dependency, or there's a risk of creating dependency on MCDI in terms of if they're not able to properly explain these or transfer this knowledge to the communities. Next slide, please. And they are also a mediator, resolving conflicts and misunderstandings, not just between the different types of actors, but also within the communities, which gives them a very large role in terms of balancing power. How do you ensure downward accountability? Who gets which benefits? And how do you balance the economic and environmental sustainability outcomes? Next slide, please. So that was a bit about MCDI as a key actor, and now we want to talk a bit about the key findings, and I'll turn the mic over to Pili.
In forest Tanzania, and specifically partnership on forestry governance. Community-based forest management has changed forest management practices, has changed how timber is marketed, and also on benefit sharing, on how benefits are distributed at household and community level, and also on gender participation. Shows that sustainability partnership, and I refer to community-based forest management, has improved forestry management in CBFM villages compared to the villages where forests are still under the state control. The implementation of CBFM is associated with the formulation of what we call village natural resource management committees. And these village natural resource management committees are responsible for protecting forests and undertaking forestry patrols. And what we found in these CBFM villages, these forestry patrols are better coordinated, well coordinated, and also members of the village natural resource committees have better skills, knowledge, and have incentives to participate in this kind of management activities, including forestry patrol. We also found that implementation of CBFM is also associated with the formulations of rules and the rules and regulations that are related to formulation of rules and regulations that are related to forest resource use, access of the forestry resources. And we found that when we asked these respondents about their views regarding the forest rules that are related to forestry access and use, they showed that 60% have accepted the forest rules that are associated with the forestry resource use. And this includes those rules that are associated with the visible benefits of forestry resources. Please, can you show the slides that talks about the first slide, the slide number 10? Because I'm just using this hard copy. I can't see in the screen. Yes. Yes. Yeah. So we also found that some respondents show that they are not accepting the rules that are related to the prohibition of the firewood collection, particularly in village natural resource, village land forestry reserves. We also asked respondents about their satisfaction level with regards to their participation in various forest management practices, and we found that over 60% of the respondents show that they are highly satisfied on how they are involved in forest management practices. Can you please go to the next slide? We also found this community-based forest management have changed how this marketing of timber are practiced in these community-based forest management villages. In the past, timber marketing were under the control of the government, and also the revenues that were received from the timber sales were also under the control of the government. But with the changes in the forest management and the introduction of this community-based forest management have given the local community the right to control the revenues that are taken, that are received from the forest, but also the control of the marketing system of the timber forest-related, of the forest-related product, including timber. However, we found that there are some challenges within this village, within this community-based forest management villages, which are associated with marketing, including unreliable marketing. For instance, we found that most of the traders are interested to go to harvest timber in areas where there's no certification of the forest, because they have to pay a premium price when they go to the certified timber villages. We also found the challenges of poor infrastructure. As you can see from the picture there, the logs are being transported from the forest, but the roads are not good, and the truck was stuck in the mud. And there are also some problems with other traders, because some of the traders are not interested to go to the forest, which have small amount of forest with variable tree species, and also with a scattered amount of tree species. Can you please move to the next slide? We also found that there are some variations on how benefits are shared at the community level when you compare it to those villages under CBFM and the villages which are not under CBFM. Those variations are found at both the community level and also at the household level. Over 50% of the revenues that are collected from the community level are used to improve the village infrastructures that benefits all community members. But at the household level, we found that there are variations. Many respondents, when they were asked about the benefits, they claimed that they have not benefited economically. About 64% of respondents claimed that they have not benefited from the revenues received from timber. And the main reason is because there is no direct provision of fund from the timber revenues, because all the revenues are shared at the community level to invest on the village infrastructure, such as health centers, also water services and education services. But respondents were also asked about the kind of the benefits they receive from the community-based forest management, and many respondents claimed that they receive conservation education from community-based forest management programs. They also receive monetary benefits and other training opportunities from those actors that are involved in implementation of community-based forestry management. But we also found that there were variations on the benefits. Benefits were not equally distributed across the sub-villages. The village infrastructures were invested at the village centers. So most of the people from the distant villages have to walk a long distance to the village center to be able to access the services and the infrastructure, to access the services. Can you move please to the next slide? There's also, we also assess the impact of community-based forest management on gender, and this is the focus of my PhD. There is an increased participation of women in CBFM activities, including forest management activities such as forest patrols, and also meetings, and also membership in Village Natural Resource Committee. And this has been due to the increase of this partnership of activities. Involvement of many actors in CBFM villages have provided trainings opportunities to members of the committee and also other community members. There's increased participation of women in CBFM activities has resulted in positive outcomes such as equity in benefit sharing, and also have reduced gender-related conflicts in the CBFM villages. However, we found that men still dominate most of the powerful top leadership positions. For instance, being chairmen of the Village Natural Resource Committees, mostly considered to be the top leadership positions, and also being secretary in Village Natural Resource Committees were also to be the top leadership position. So we found that most of men were dominating this kind of this top leadership position as compared to we also found that men dominate highly paid activities such as timber harvesting activities, and such as forestry certification. Can you please go to the next one? Based on our findings, these are our conclusions. Clear procedures and benefit sharing and decision making have to large extent improved forest governance in community-based forestry management. However, we found variation on benefit sharing at community level. More benefits are accrued at the community level than at the household level. I have seen that most of the respondents asked at the household level claimed that they have not benefited economically from the community-based forestry programs. There's high trust in MCDA as a local NGO, and also high belief in CBFM among community members has enabled these communities to want to expand their village under CBFM. Many have expanded the villages under CBFM, and others also want to expand their village land forestry reserve. And lastly, partnerships with the CBFM have led to changes in how community access the timber markets and have made them increasingly depending on it and on external actors. This is our end of presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Billy. I'll hand over the words to Raja from Salaam and Lasse Folke Hendriksen. Could you please keep it within 10 minutes? We are quite delayed. Okay, the word is. I'll hand over the word to Raja.
Okay, thank you, Stefan. I'll be presenting this part together with Lasse. Can we show the slides, please? Okay, we proceed while they are sharing the slides. Quoting Ostrom, who said that if complexity is the nature of the system we have an interest in governing, it is essential to think seriously about complexity in the governance system that are proposed. In our book,
we express governance complexity. Next. We express governance complexity in two components. The first one is institutional complexity, and the second one is network complexity. The institutional complexity is about ownership and the participatory procedures versus the top-down state system. The network complexity is the complex set of relationships among diverse actors set participating in a formalized governance collaboration. Next, please. So why networking matter in natural resource management? They matter because the high network promise more efficient and equitable natural resource management, and therefore it is important to start them. And also they support the local and the social learning. So through network, we learn, or the community and the other actor learn through the network available. The network also fosters the trust among and between actors, and this trust helps the management of natural resource in place. The bonding nature of the actors also supports the management quality and environmental outcome, while the bridging of this actor are important for the information flow from one actor to the other actor. Next. So we map the village network and the resource use over different period and the place. And the project started in 2016 to 2019, where the data for network were collected and analyzed. So there was initial village site visit, where we selected our site, and we collected different documents that facilitated us to get the network data. We did also field observation and interview, whereby in the interview we collected network data from key informants that are from the organization and institution that we visited, as well as from the local community. We also visited these guest books and collected information about different actors who visited different villages and institutions, and therefore we triangulated the information from the guest book with the interviews and the focus group discussion, as well as the field observation. And then the data were coded, and we categorized our network data in terms of financial network or collaboration, and the regulation or governance roles, business, as well as technical and the technical role. Next, please. So I'll take you through the network in coastal resources. In this natural resource, we collected the network data from 1995, different from other sectors, because in the marine park, the MREMP, the process started earlier in 1995. Therefore, there were some actors we found they were being mentioned by, when we are doing these key informative interviews and the other data collection method, we found that there were several actors who were there at the initial stage of planning for the establishment of marine park. So we thought it was better to include them in understanding how these contributed in the management of coastal resources. The marine park had more actors than the beach management unit, which is the complex. The marine park is the simpler, while the BMU is the complex. But the actors were more in marine park than the beach management unit, And most of the actors in both Marine Park and the beach management units are NGOs, non-government organizations. And more actors who played the role on financials or were donors were more found in Marine Park than the beach management unit. So the establishment of the Marine Park were facilitated much, or they got much financial support from donors than the beach management unit. Also in both Marine Park and the beach management unit, technical roles were more performed by majority of actors than any other role or collaborative role. So, next slide. We also looked at the centrality of actors, and we found that the Mtwara District Council is more central, and this is because of the administrative role it plays. And therefore, each actor who visited or wants to perform any duty or role in Mtwara has to visit first at Mtwara District Council. And also, we found that the Msimbati village is more central compared with other villages in the area. And the centrality of these actors were influenced by the geographical location, the history of the actor, and the role of the institution organization that it plays. That the geography, it means that the area is reachable. The role means each actor has to visit that area. Thank you. Let me welcome Lasse to continue.
Thank you very much, Faraja. You guys hear me? Hello? So what Faraja just illustrated elegantly was how the use of social network analysis and the collection of social network data across all these different sites enabled sort of more specific configurational analysis of these different partnerships. So we often talk about the institutional complexities of these partnerships, but what the network analysis enables is to be much more precise and specific in terms of analyzing not only the composition of actors within the different partnerships, but also the structure of relationships. And Faraja illustrated through these network graphics what institutional complexity looks like in terms of networks. Next slide, please. I'm going to give you one example from the forestry case, not only about the structure of the networks, but also their impact on forest use over time. So what we basically did, as Faraja explained, was to go to each of the villages that we studied to map out the historical evolution of networks over time, from when the partnerships were formed, or even before, until 2018, when our data collection stopped. As Mette and Pille also explained, forestry was one of the really successful cases where we saw intensive network building, and where both firms and NGOs and government agencies became really active in the village level networks. But what we also saw was significant variation across villages. So some villages developed network that contained lots of local NGOs, whereas other villages developed networks that had many more private sector actors like firms. And so one thing we did in this study was to triangulate this network data, where we mapped the networks of the villages over time, with remote sensing data, where we could track forest use over time as well, to compare these complex partnerships, the village land forest reserves, with the state-governed or state-managed national forest reserves. So one methodological challenge in this, of course, is that there is selectivity in terms of what forest becomes part of village land forest reserves and national forest reserves. So we did machine learning or complex matching to make sure that we could actually compare the forest plots from the national forest reserves with the village land forest reserves in terms of their geographical traits. But what we also did was, previous slide, please. What we also did was to run models where we could compare the risk of deforestation, which is the x-axis here, for the two types of partnerships, controlling for the network variation that we observed via these mappings versus models where we did not control for this, okay? And so what you see on this graph here, what you see on this graph here is that when we control for networks, in the case of village land forest reserves, we see a difference in terms of their performance. The village land forest reserves, when we account for networks, that is the blue, perform worse because part of the explanation for why they perform well is the networks. So in the models where we don't account for networks, the two red ones, they actually perform equally well when we do these matching exercises. And what this model shows is that part of the explanation for why village land forest reserves do well is that they develop certain kinds of networks. Next slide, please. And so one thing we look closer into, so what kinds of networks did well? One thing we could see was that for villages that developed highly dense network with close triangles, that is, where villages work with several organizations that also collaborate mutually, the risk of deforestation was lower. More importantly, though, what we observed was that villages that contained many firms or many private sector organizations, possibly indicating that market forces were stronger and extraction forces were stronger, experienced significantly more deforestation. Lastly, what we observed was that villages that had highly dense civil society networks experienced significantly less risk of deforestation. So what this shows is that the composition of these networks clearly matter for resource use and how it evolves over time, and also the structure of relationships. In this case, how often organizations that the villages work with also collaborate in different ways. Next slide, please. So this was a case study from forestry, but we also mapped the network complexity across all the 24 villages that were part of the project across different sites. And one finding, which Stefano also pointed to, was that we saw this significant association between the complex partnerships that had formal institutional procedures that involved co-management and then the network complexity that they developed over time. Next slide, please. So what were our conclusions? Well, institutionally more complex partnerships also developed more complex networks, or rather the other way around. Because what we could see in the historical sequencing was that the villages that also developed complex partnerships already had networks in place to some extent. What we also found was that mapping these, the social networks of the partnerships enabled these more precise and concrete configurational analysis of how these complex institutional partnerships actually look like, not only in terms of the types of actors and the number of actors, but also the structure of relationship in terms of financial support, technical assistance, formal governance, collaborations, etc. We found that more complex sites had better forest protection, both in forestry and wildlife sectors, but for other resource users, we found very mixed evidence, and there were some issues around data quality, which has to be discussed. We also linked this to the survey data that Stefano talked about earlier, and we found no association between the complexity of the networks and the local perceptions of resource quality. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lasse.
Was that on time?
Well, not really. Can I call on Mikkel to round up? Thank you very much. Mikkel Funder is senior researcher here at DIIS.
Hallo, hallo. Skal jeg prøve en anden? Nej, nu var den der. Yeah. Thank you very much. And congratulations to the authors of both books. They are clearly truly collaborative exercises. They're also available open access. I think this is really, you're setting an example for the rest of us to follow. I have also really enjoyed going into detail with Tanzania, with one country today. That's rare these days that we get sessions so long in seminars like this, where we focus on just one country. So I feel a little bit guilty, but I will actually take us out of that particular context right now. Because as I was reading the book, it struck me how useful your methods and approaches and thinking could also be to bigger and broader dynamics. And to illustrate that, I want to show you a 1.5-minute video, which was made by the Bezos Earth Fund. That fund was established by Jeff Bezos. It has $10 billion in it. And in this, he's the founder of Amazon, one of the richest guys on the planet. And in this video, he is in the forests of Gabon, together with his vice chair, Lauren Sanchez. The video is interesting partly for some of the narratives that come out, but also for some of the people that he's together with. And now I hope it works. Yeah? This is good. How do I get it to roll? Rock and roll. Okay, you got noise? Sound? There should be sound. Sound is good. That's the YouTube version. Should we try that? This sounds off here? Yeah, that's nice. But I can't switch it back on. Yeah? Should we try?
Ja. Okay, super.
Må du hellere lige sætte den til, så vi kører.
Laura and I are very committed to nature. We're committed to conservation. We're committed to restoration.
This group is mostly focused on conservation, done in the right places, in the right way, working with governments, working with local communities.
This is a forest that is, quite frankly, the only remaining healthy lung of the planet. We really need to make sure that not only do we create these protected areas, we sustain them.
The Congo Basin is one of the largest carbon sinks in the world, and we'd all like to keep it that way.
We're talking about in excess of 1 billion tons of CO2 a year just being sucked out of the atmosphere.
What makes it difficult?
When we talk about good governance, which usually has sort of two elements. One is corruption, and the other is just lack of capacity.
It's not only weak governance, not only corruption, but lack of enforcement.
We've basically had to go to war. The criminals trying to kill the elephants and steal the gold and the trees are willing to kill us.
It's going to take radical partnerships for us to get all of this work to add up to the impact we want to see.
And the world cannot afford to lose the Congo.
We thank all of you for doing this work on the ground. I know intellectually how hard it is, but every time I have a meeting like this, I realize I only know the tip of the iceberg about how hard this is.
And it's very inspiring how passionate all of you are about the work you're doing.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
All right. So, partnerships. Here we go. No. See it again. There you go. Right. So I showed this video just because I wanted to point to some of the new players that are coming into conservation and sustainability governance in general. It's not just philanthropists. It's also the big companies, the multinational corporations like Shell. They want to be net zero by 2050. So they're investing in forest and climate programs in Asia, in Latin America. They're also investing in resilience and adaptation among farmers in Zambia and in Senegal. We've got the Gates Foundation, $375 million for adaptation among small-scale farmers. And then we've got private conservation protected area management companies like African Parks from South Africa, who are now managing for the government particular protected areas around Africa. So we've got all these new players coming in, and that creates some really strange partnerships, strange bedfellows. In this video, we saw Jeff Bezos together with the Wildlife Conservation Society. That might not be so surprising, but there's also the Tenure Facility, who work for indigenous people's rights. There's the World Resources Institute, which is a policy research institute, and widely known and acclaimed. And they are in turn part of a bigger regional project or program called the Congo Basin Forest Partnership. And we heard none other than Wangari Maathai's daughter, saying in this video, there's a need for radical partnerships. This leads to some really interesting discourse coalitions. If you go to the website of the Bezos Earth Fund, you will see the words environmental justice, transformational change, and a really academic term like no silver bullets, right? These very complex partnerships, I think, are quite important to understand, and I think that your methods actually really provide an opportunity to do that. In this project, you have focused specifically on Tanzania. It could be interesting also maybe for you or for others to apply this more broadly. Still, for example, keeping an anchor in one country and then scaling up to even broader networks. Another thing that I think you're doing that's really interesting in this program is to show then some of the outcomes for communities of these partnerships. The role of communities in conservation and sustainability partnerships has changed over the years, from originally being those who were seen to be the problem, and then discursively moving towards being seen as stakeholders, partners, and now there's a variety of approaches. I think what you're showing in some of the studies is then the outcomes of this. We have good examples from the village forests, but as you also pointed out, a seat at the table does not guarantee you anything, and you state in the paper, in the chapter. And I think you also show how rights can be rolled back. So we see in community-based conservation around Africa that sometimes the state gives over authority and revenue, but then it takes it back again. So nothing is permanent. I wanted to then challenge you all a little bit on the issue of decolonizing conservation. As I'm sure you know very well, there is a critique that conservation, as it goes on in Africa and many other continents, is dependent too much on external financing, on tourism, on donors, on trophy hunting. And it involves knowledges and values and norms that were brought over from colonial times or are still being implemented through, for example, the training that you mentioned. And then there are various alternatives proposed. I won't go into detail with those now, but I was just curious to hear what you think about what this means for partnerships. Does it mean, as for example, some Kenyan conservationists are now beginning to say that we don't need anybody else. We will solve this ourselves. And what does it mean for the state? Does it mean that the communities do not need the state? So I think it would be interesting to hear some reflections on that. My last slide. I was wondering a little bit about the agency of communities in the partnerships. You talk about how the communities feel they have benefited or not benefited. And you do point out that the benefits are not felt to be that big, at least outside the community forests or the village forests. But then what do they do? This is something that I think would be really important to get into your analysis. Many years ago, we did a study in Iringa which showed how communities in the village forests actually used participatory monitoring data and sort of grabbed it away from the forest agency in order to take more control of knowledge around the village forests. We're seeing something similar in some southern conservancies in Kenya, some conservancies in southern Kenya. So I'd really like to hear more about that if you have any experiences about that. Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Okay. We are 5 minutes over time. Should we stay and have a few minutes Q&A, or should we take the Q&A out here? We stay a little bit. So please, let's have a few questions for both books. Yes, we've been through a lot of information, and so if we take 10-15 minutes of Q&A, and we will come out, and afterwards we can do it with directly with the speakers. Any questions? There must be lots of questions, actually.
Thank you very much for some very interesting presentations. And just about the last position and reflection on partnerships, who's driving who in those partnerships? You see the private sector driving the communities and the government, or is it the government and the communities that are having a say in some of those partnerships?
Could we have more questions?
In addition to that, could somebody talk about the legislation used in these organizations? Is it local or the international?
Yes, but I think is Barbara checking on questions? Is there any questions from online? No, there's not yet. Should we take those two questions first? Stefano, will you?
So I'm not sure I can really kind of come to terms with the diversity of that. I mean, the one that I know a little bit better, because I was part of the group on coastal resources, is so we in coastal resources essentially we looked at the difference between the marine park, which is fairly classic top-down. The government sets up the marine park essentially on the heads of local communities, and then they start rolling out translations of central regulation on access to fisheries and combating dynamite fishing. As part of that, then there is a whole area of the sea that is no take from local communities. And what happens is that yes, it's no take when somebody's looking, and then it's all take when nobody's looking. And then there is this big setup of the marine park is supposed to bring in income from tourism. Tourism never materializes. The gate is always open. Nobody collects any money. The local communities are saying, well, is there a real marine park here? I mean, except that we can't fish, then there is nothing else that looks like a park. And at the beginning, a lot of consultation locally, but then after 2 or 3 meetings, no more. So it became a classic sort of top-down, here's the project, we established a marine park. Alternative livelihood projects went nowhere. And then all of a sudden, the dynamite fishing stops. And so we're like, oh, so it must be in a marine park. No, military operation from the regional office for about 2 months, put everyone in prison, take off all the all the fishing nets that were illegal, and then take off all the, put in or chase after those who were fishing with dynamite. And then you move on, and then after 3 months, everybody's back doing what they were doing before. So that's a really terrible example of how not to do a partnership. Beach management units are a bit different. They're instruments of local government. There's a lot of problems with those too, but there's a lot more control from communities and local governments, and they've been able to be more accepted in the local communities. At the same time, there's a duplication of functions. So you have the village level management committee, environmental management committee, and then you have the beach management unit that do exactly the same things. And they're both at the village level. And there is a lot of infighting politically. So I could go on forever, but but the forestry story is very different, the one that you hear before. So part of the work we were doing at the end with the quantitative work was also trying to understand beyond the details what is the overall story, and that's the story that Lasse tried to kind of bring into the place. Sorry.
Thanks a lot, Dan. Well,
sure.
Are you from the floor?
No, I'm going to respond to the question, the first question about the nature of the partnership. But I was also going to ask Christine if you can hear. Would you be able to respond to the question about legislation and how local and international it is? Because I think that's something you've been publishing about recently. I'll just have a quick response about the nature of the partnerships. And I think it's useful to reflect on the video that you so helpfully showed about Jeff Bezos. I think they heard them say the world cannot afford to lose the Congo, which I think means that because of historically high levels of carbon which have come from the global north, now the whole world, and particularly the countries where the Congo forests are inhabited, have now got to keep that forest to pay for our carbon debt. Further, they said that we are basically had to go to war here. So they have to use high levels of military force to shoot African residents, poachers of those forests who are behaving in ways which is detrimental to the polluters in the global north. Can you spot the problems here about the nature of the partnerships which are required for that to work? And where you have that sort of rhetoric, then you're going to empower partnerships which are not well rooted in the ground. There's two observations in that. First of all, I'm not sure how new this is. This is mainstream conservation with another naught added onto the end of it. And it's now billions of pounds, not hundreds of millions. The second thing is that the really massive surprise and shock for me when I was working in rural areas around the Salaam Game Reserve, now National Park, was how the conservation depredations that we were coming across affected a minority of people. I was not expecting that. When we asked people about the changes in one particular village where there were a lot of increase in elephants, they said, well, it's just got so much richer. And I almost wanted to say, no, that's a wrong answer. Please, can you tell me about the increasing poverty because of elephants? They said, no, we've been growing sesame. Sesame is not quite elephant-proof. It is not damaged by elephants as badly as our other crops are. And that has been making us much more prosperous. And the conservation stuff was going on in the background, which means that the partnerships, the thing that a lot of rural Tanzanians were concerned about was not so much the conservation stuff. It was their ability to grow and sell crops. And that was what was so important to them, which in fact was tying in with the earlier story. Christine, I'm done. Over to you. Sorry to talk to so long.
We can't hear you. Sorry. It's not from our side. We can't hear you, Christine.
Hello? You hear me now?
Yes, thank you very much.
Oh, okay.
Please repeat.
Yeah, just quickly, that is to remind you that most of conservation budgets is donor funded in Tanzania. Until recently, almost 45% of conservation funds had come from the donor and development partners basket. And that way, the government is kind of obliging to the demands that are required from the donors. But it also, the government also had its own interest to secure more land for conservation, because there is a prospect for increasing tourism and therefore increasing levels of income from tourism. Now, what Dan just mentioned about legislation and how it is, whether it is locally or influenced from outside, is referring to the paper I wrote recently about Berlin CAS, and I indicated how the process is highly influenced by international conservation actors who do not just contribute funds for conservation, but they hold the process of making these international laws. And I made reference to World Commission for World Heritage, which had domineered and strongly decided that the country cannot decide on the use or even of land, which is World Heritage. So there is pressure from outside, from conservation actors who have, kind of legal powers, because there are also international laws, but also the government had its own interests. Until only recently, 2 years, that we saw a lot of efforts for the government to re-centralize, because in the process of policy reforms in the 1990s, a lot of powers were, taken down to the communities, were supposed to be taken down to communities, and some legislations did so, except for few sectors, including the wildlife sector, which did not really do so much on that. But recently, the government has been trying to re-centralize, and therefore most of controls of funds coming from forest resources, even though there's a difference here, but still Tanzania Forest Services has a lot of control of forest resources, forest funds that come from village land. And therefore they also have interest to expand forest resources because of that kind of interest in financial gains. So what I'm adding here is that different actors have their different roles to play, and they have powers differently, but also they have interest differently. The government is currently re-centralizing because it has lost some powers, but the World Conservation Organizations have also interest to maintain and to expand protected areas. So legislations have conflicts of interest of actors as well as we speak. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Are we okay for another question? I have a question here online saying, with regards to the ongoing discussion about the problematic North-South research collaboration, what lesson experience does NEPSUS offer for future collaboration? Christine, could you answer that?
Please, I'm happy to answer this.
Just a second, we collect some more. Lisa?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Noe and colleagues, for the presentations today. I wanted to just return to some of the larger issues that I think we've had coming up in discussions of both of these excellent books, which is where Knut compared the stereotypes that we have of rural farmers who are actually much more willing to adapt and change than we had expected. And I wonder if you can reflect on the policy and activist communities, because I think that Mikkel's conclusion was extremely powerful about whether or not we see these communities as willing to adapt and change as local Tanzanian farmers. And one area where I see this need for adaptation is to not continually basically come back again with this neo-Malthusian argument that the solution to poverty in Tanzania is having fewer poor people. The total fertility rate in Tanzania has been dropping consistently since the 1990s when I, like many of you, wrote a book on Tanzania. Tanzanian reproductive health issues have been extremely high priority, and I'm very happy to hear that Mama Samia is taking them up. But this is not the way in which we deal with urbanization issues, with migration issues. And yet this kind of stereotype, together with we have to go to war for conservation, and, you know, the world can't afford to lose Congo. Well, Congo doesn't belong to the world. Congo belongs to the Congolese. How do we combat these stereotypes? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Christine? We can't hear you, Christine.
Research collaborations, South, North, and
yes.
The experience of NEPSAS in this. This is not really to brag, but this was the best experience, I would say. We had a complex team of people from different disciplines, and definitely the North and South balance was in the sense of capacity, that the North had a lot more capacity, but we were all on the same ground that we need to build the capacity. So what I can share about this research is the kind of leadership that we had, which looked at capacity building as the main point for collaboration. And we had an excellent demonstration of what teams can do together when they identify the gaps in their capacities, but also leadership in terms of how to manage these projects and how also to work together. We had very good experiences of working together. Not that there were no problems, but we learned from problems and mistakes, and we managed to get a lot of good experiences also out of these challenges of managing a complex team. So I would say we came to the end of the project with the team that is solid together. We lost few people who had other work to do in the middle of implementation of the project, but others also joined in the mid and became very instrumental for the project. So we saw the team reducing, but also getting new members who picked up so quickly, and very, very positively, the relationship in this project, I would say, was one of admirable one because of the level of capacity built in this. We did trainings on data analysis, mostly that empowered both. It's not just the North training the South, but also the North team had a lot of experience gained also in the South. We had 3 PhDs, and for us in the South, training staff members of universities to PhD level and also building their research capacity and writing skills, it is one of the things that is really lacking in most teams, but it was well done in NEPSAS. We have our PhDs, 3 PhDs who graduated with publications. They are part of the book. Their work has been published in international journals also. And therefore, I can talk a lot about this kind of collaboration in a very positive way. So I don't know how to say more than this, but it was one of my best experiences in collaboration for research. And I would like to return the second question from Lisa to Dan to start. I will add if I must.
Thank you very much, Christine. I think we should, I think I will take Lisa's more as a comment, maybe. Did you want to add something else? I would like to say that we should maybe round up. Who wants to add something? Okay, you round up now then.
I'm rounding up.
Yes.
So, Lisa, yes, how do you combat the stereotypes which lead people to believe that smallholder farmers cannot look after the Congo, cannot become more prosperous, which you find at all levels of society in the global north. You find it in Tanzania too. And you find it in part because our books, what you were saying, it's complex and hard to read. They need to be better communicated. With great difficulty, I'm afraid, because we're talking about prejudices which are forged in children's literature, in film, in popular accounts, in really annoying promotional videos, which you shared, and I'm glad you did, with us just now. And when I look at the writing of social science, of which I'm part, I often find it very hard to read. Do you know that book by Michael Billig, Learn to Write Badly? How to Succeed in the Social Sciences? It's a very cogent and powerful analysis. And you fight stereotypes like that on their own ground, in their form, in their idiom, using simplifications which are not so horrible. These are things which we are not well equipped to do as researchers and scientists, and so therefore you fight them in collaboration with other people who are. That would be my 2 cents.
Thank you very much. I think we should continue the talk over a glass of wine or a snack outside. I hope you can stay a few minutes. Thank you very much.